Welcome to the Matthew Moran podcast. Here you will find a series of in-depth conversations with the world's best nature photographers, filmmakers, conservationists, editors, writers, and publishers. You will get an insight into the lives of creative professionals and industry experts, what goes on in their minds, how they approach their work, and how they make it pay. The podcast also looks at the role that photography and filmmaking plays in helping to raise awareness about the global plight of species. And despite the depressing statistics, we look for solutions at what we can all do to contribute to conservation. All my guests give up their precious time and are incredibly generous of spirit. So this is my chance to share these conversations with you. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. Today, my guest is Will Burrard-Lucas. Will is a British wildlife photographer who got hooked on East African wildlife at a young age after spending much of his childhood in Tanzania. His fascination with the natural world kept him going back, and his entrepreneurial spirit drove him to build his own camera traps to get as close as he could to potentially dangerous animals such as rhinos and lions. He also invented BeetleCam, a small remote-controlled buggy that enables him to get a fresh, ground-level perspective with a wide-angle lens. And Will shares some great stories about the trials and tribulations, but like all his work, the perseverance is what elevates the pictures, and the results have been incredible. Just have a look at the links on the podcast page on my site to see some stunning images he captured of a black leopard in Kenya last year. We also talk about the early days of BeetleCam, founding his company Camtraptions, who create and sell a whole range of camera trap equipment worldwide, his book projects, finding time for it all, and much more. I hope you enjoy it. Please share it as far and wide as you can. Here's the show. We're here in your office, Will, are we in Aylesbury?
Beaconsfield.
Beaconsfield.
Yeah,
okay.
Not far from Aylesbury.
That's the problem with we're driving and just relying on Google Maps. You kind of forget.
Close enough. Same county.
But I've just been given a tour of Will's museum of inventions and
beaten up cameras.
It's been such a treat, really exciting to see. And just to give you a bit of flavour of Will's office, it's I'd say it's very organised, very clean.
It's not always like this, I'll tell you.
Is that because I was coming?
It's because I just had to renew the lease, so they inspected the office, which forced me to tidy.
Brilliant.
It was a bit of an undertaking.
Well, it's a great space, and I'm seeing lots of what look like specialist tools for adapting and inventing BeetleCams, camera traps, and other great things that Will's been working on for many, many years. We'll get more into that.
Yeah. All this clutter is the reason I got kicked out of the house and had to get my office in the first place.
Yeah, I can see why. But thank you so much for taking the time.
No problem. Thanks. I'm a fan of the podcast, so it's great to be here.
That was great to discover. Yeah, when I met you last year at Wildlife Photographer of the Year, that you'd been listening. So you're on. And actually, it's great to have someone like you on this podcast. Who has been, working as a wildlife photographer for, how long? How many years have you been doing it now?
So I got into wildlife photography back in 2003-ish and built it up to a point where I left my job to do it full time in 2010. So 12 years.
What was your job?
So when I first got into photography, I was still at uni. After that, I then became an accountant at PwC in London for 3.5 years. I qualified as an accountant. And at that point, I always did that sort of knowing one day I'd do my own thing. I didn't know what. Accountancy sort of keeps your options open. And then I qualified, and that's something that you've then always got to fall back on if things don't work out. So I thought that was the time. It was actually the year we got married. So I got married a week later. Was my last day. A week before I got married was my last day as an accountant. And since then I've been a sort of semi-employed photographer. But fortunately haven't had to go back to the accountancy. Yeah,
that's great. Well, I mean, it's been in the research that I've been looking at of you over the last couple of weeks. It's been really great watching, some of your early videos and the development of not only your photography, but you as an inventor, I guess. Yeah. And is that something that you were doing a lot as a kid? Were you into making things and exploring and experimenting and also failing? Yeah,
definitely. I mean, as a kid, I was always creating stuff out of Lego and not following the instructions, always just riffing and building my own things. So I've built things like tree houses and stuff. I enjoyed being creative that way. But I never sort of got into photography wanting to apply that side of who I am, but sort of it just came out naturally, really. Like as I started to want to take pictures where my ability to maybe get close to the animals was limited, it just came naturally to me to, invent something to do that for me. So yeah, it's sort of those two sort of interests, photography and that inventive side, have been quite mutually beneficial, I guess.
Yeah, and I can see how it obviously really works very well with wildlife, but I was interested in why wildlife and why that style of photography when you got into it.
Well, so the wildlife and the interest in nature came from well before I got into photography. So when I was little, young boy, I was very fortunate to live in Tanzania for 3.5 years. So those are pretty much my earliest memories from that time. And it was obviously a very formative stage in my life. And so ever since then, being someone who's lived in Africa and been on safari was a big part of my identity as a child growing up. And I always had that interest in the natural world. And then photography came along much later. Yeah, with the advent of digital, that's when I got into photography. And very quickly, those two interests in nature and photography just came together, really. And so, again, it was not intentional. It was just this sort of meshing together of my interests.
Did you shoot any film ever?
So I did have a film camera, but never got into photography at that stage. Like I could see the appeal, but just my photos are rubbish. And having that sort of gap between taking the photo and seeing how it ended up, I just never progressed. The cost of film put me off. And so, yeah, it was something I sort of could appreciate good photography, but I was never going to progress until I got that digital camera and could then just sit with my subject and keep experimenting until I sort of captured it roughly the way I wanted. So then at that point, it really skyrocketed my sort of interest and enthusiasm for photography. But yeah, it was definitely a product of the digital era.
And that's amazing, isn't it? Because the timing of these things, you think if you were, just 2 or 3 years younger, you probably would have done a lot more on film just because the quality of digital.
Or I just might not have got into photography. I might have left university having not picked up photography properly, not had the time to get into it, and it might never have happened. So I was sort of right there at the forefront. I was at university, had these long summer holidays, was able to sort of backpack and stuff, just as digital cameras were getting good and affordable. And I guess, lucky timing.
Yeah, and that's great. I mean, it's something that I always talk about, and I sound like a disgruntled older photographer, starting on film and going through that pain of shooting rolls and rolls and not seeing them for weeks on end. But I always celebrate digital photography, not only for what it's given us creatively, but how it did really democratize photography. So, people were able to afford, good quality cameras for a lower cost. It sort of made it less elite.
And just the cost of taking, to take 2,000 photos and it doesn't cost you anything. Whereas with film, it was just prohibitive when you were in that learning phase. So that was the key thing.
Yeah, and did you have anyone early on that you were looking at or trying to replicate? And going down, sort of, I think in the kind of late 90s, early 2000s, photography was very much a long lens game, particularly for wildlife. And you've become a real specialist using wide angle. We can talk a little bit more about that later with camera traps. But was there anyone that you looked at in particular?
I can't remember photography wise. Like my mum was into photography from the film days. And so I was sort of always exposed to photography through her. And then, I was an avid sort of digester of natural history programs, obviously, David Attenborough, BBC Natural History Unit programs. And so I think those two things were my biggest influence. Obviously there were things like National Geographic magazine, but I was looking at them looking at the pictures and that, not really knowing who the photographers were still at that stage. I think it was only when I really started to get into it that I then started to follow these things more closely.
Yeah. And did you go, I mean, obviously you had this relationship with Africa and Tanzania and going on safari, and was your quest in the first days to shoot with a long lens, or did you already sort of start thinking about how can I get closer with field craft and technology and stuff like that?
It was definitely, at first I was like, all right, I need a longer lens if I'm going to get photos like this. So I think to start with, you're just trying to, see these good photos in magazines and then trying to figure out what do I need to be able to take photos like that. So yes, it was very much a long lens and holidays to these exotic places to sort of try and start to build up photos like that. And I guess then figuring out, once you sort of get the basics, then it's sort of figuring out, maybe trying to make work a bit different, but that certainly came a lot later.
Yeah. And your journey up until that point, and of course, one of the things that's we often talk about in this podcast, and actually still today, is trying to make a living out of doing what we love doing.
Yeah.
And did you know early on that's? I mean, obviously, you're a qualified accountant. You could have had a very comfortable life.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not saying that job is easy, but certainly trying to make a living out of taking images of animals isn't.
So,
Did you have kind of reality checks with that early on?
I've always been really entrepreneurial. And in fact, through university, something that took up much more of my time than photography even was building like web businesses and stuff. And I always knew, as I said, that I'd do my own thing one day. And I thought it would just be make some website that I could sell for millions or something. And so that was sort of my goal a lot of, in those early years. But then as I built these web businesses, they sort of, in the end, always kind of fizzled just because I lost interest. And I realized that whatever I did, it had to be something I was passionate about, would do for free anyway. And where it was, I think to continue that interest long term, once we got over that exciting building phase. So I sort of, I guess, recalibrated and realized, it's not trying to pick the most profitable niche or whatever. It's finding what I want to do and then figuring out how to make it work. But fortunately, all that entrepreneurial experience played in well in that, when I became a photographer, I experimented with so many different ways to try and make it pay really from, I've sold all sorts of things from, courses and web advertising, you name it, I tried it. And so I love that experimenting side. And obviously in a competitive niche like photography, where a lot of people are willing to do it for free, it is quite a hard space to work in. But because for me, it never did feel like work, it was always what I wanted to be doing anyway. I think that was the key, and that's what allowed me to stick with it, for now 2 decades. And, whatever you do, it's perseverance and sticking with it long term that really is what pays dividends in the end. And so, that's I guess the realization I came to eventually.
Yeah, and it's great to hear because with anyone listening to these podcasts over the years, it's that perseverance, the dedication, sticking to it it's often when I run workshops, for example, I might get someone say to me, I don't have a creative eye, for example, and it's actually not really that. It's actually hard work and actually going back to locations over and over again and making tons of mistakes. And that's how, I guess, that is what makes the difference between success and failure, whatever you call success. And that doesn't necessarily mean making a living from it. If you really enjoy it, of course, that's great. But you clearly had that passion just to keep you going, even though you'd tried all these ways of monetizing it, just keeping going and really enjoying it seems to be.
Exactly. And then it's a case of when you find something that works, spotting that and then doubling down on it.
Yeah, that was something I really enjoyed listening to about your TED Talk, because I think when you're saying it yourself as a photographer and as a tutor, as a mentor, hearing other photographers talking about, finding a subject, double down on it, going to town, and also making that the access to that subject is very important, making the subject accessible.
Yeah, and I think it's applicable to anything you're doing. That's what I tried to do with that talk, was not make it just applicable to photography. Whatever you're doing, and just that power of perseverance is really what's key.
Yeah, for sure. And so, can you remember when you first started experimenting with wildlife photography and throwing away the long lens and thinking about getting out the wide angle and how you were going to achieve different images? Because also one of the limiting things, I guess, about going on photography trips to Africa is mostly you're in a vehicle, mostly you're constrained to certain roads. How do you go about trying to get that special access, or use things like you've invented with the Beetle Cam and permissions and all of those? Those are kind of issues outside of actually the technological issues of getting these images. How did that kind of journey begin? Do you remember?
So I guess it kind of happened serendipitously, in that it was around 2008, 2009. I was doing a lot of photography with my brother back then. And we were just looking for ways to capture something a bit different. And we did a trip to photograph meerkats in Botswana. And these are one of the few creatures in Africa you can crawl up to and get close to. And they were quite habituated. And so, we were experimenting using wide angle lens, getting close and trying to show them in their environment, and instantly fell in love with this perspective. The next year we managed to go to the Falkland Islands and kind of do the same thing with penguins, which, they have no fear of people. And if you lie on the path or whatever, they'll hop right up to your lens. So again, using this wide angle perspective, and straight away it resonated with us. And, we just dreamed of doing it with more and more creatures and species. And then it was figuring out how would you do that with a lion or an elephant? And it was quite an obvious solution for me, let's try sticking it on a remote control buggy, not knowing at all whether it was going to work or not. But figured in order to try and get something different, it was worth trying it and taking a risk. So it was a very basic creation, the first Beetle Cam. It was kind of like a robot base, which the camera was bolted onto, and got in touch with the lodge in the concession we were going to, and found out, can we bring this along and give it a go? And they were happy. So just took it out there and had no idea what to expect, whether the animals would run away at the first sight of it, whether they would destroy it straight away, but figured it was worth trying out. And on day one, started to get photos of elephants that really were proving the concept, and it was very exciting. And then day two, perhaps got a bit carried away and tried it with lions, and that didn't go so well. I guess I've told the story before, but this lion, as soon as she saw this thing moving through the grass, straight up, clamped her jaws around it and ran off with it. And that's one of the things I showed you in the museum, was the camera that she destroyed that day.
It's amazing. Yeah, I've seen the evidence of the canines sunk deep into the camera.
But fortunately, the memory card did survive, and got a couple of photos of her approaching that when I showed them and published them, they were widely, reshared and published and things, and it really proved the concept that this was a perspective that captured people's attention. Really, it was a bit different. And ever since then, it was actually a couple of years before I summoned up the courage to try Beetle Cam again, but did try it again. The results really built on what I'd done previously. And ever since then, Beetle Cam has kind of just been this tool that I revisit again and again through different projects to give this more intimate perspective.
And you're forgetting, you actually, the second time, or when you revisit it, you decided to put a housing on top of it.
Oh yes, of course, try and learn from learn from what went wrong last time. So yes, Beetle Cam's now on the 6th generation, and the first improvement was obviously put a housing on. That housing actually was something they could get their claws into and then still flip it over. So then the next version was a much smoother housing, and then making it stronger. And then the latest version is actually something I had finally had time to revisit during the first lockdown. It was something I'd been meaning to do for ages, but basically update Beetle Cam for this mirrorless generation of cameras. So being able to basically use a much smaller camera and make the whole thing just stronger and more robust. And so the new Beetle Cam, I created in 2020 now, and I've been using it a lot in my new projects.
That's awesome. It's so exciting. It's really wonderful. And again, I was thinking maybe we could take just some snapshots of it, and we can put this as part of the post.
For sure.
So people can see what we're talking about as well. It was definitely the most exciting thing coming into Will's office and seeing the museum and the development of this. But this is something that you were always thinking about your own photography rather than developing.
All of my creations, I'd say, have started from a particular photo I want to take, close-up wide angle or photo of this particular species, and then figuring out what I need to do to get that, and if I need to build something, just going ahead and making it happen. So I've created a lot of, I guess you'd call them prototypes over the years, to try and get certain shots that I've envisaged that I know would be achievable and that are something a bit different that maybe it's not been done so much before.
But you have been approached and they have been used in natural history TV making, is that right?
So right from the beginning with Beetle Cam, I then started getting other photographers who perhaps weren't so inclined to build these things themselves coming to me and asking for, can I build one of them for them? And so I saw that there was a market. I had no idea how big it was. And so started small, building, the odd Beetle Cam here and there for people. But I always thought, the opportunities to use Beetle Cam are pretty limited. There's only so many people that actually want to drive their camera and put it in harm's way in front of a lion. And so I knew that camera traps were a much more broader market, and there was much more applications for that. And so that's then what I ended up focusing on, is turning my camera trap that I developed again for myself, but turning them into a product for other photographers.
And when you developed the first Beetle cam, did camera trap? I actually have no idea when the early generations existed.
So there were early camera traps, like people like Nick Nichols had been using camera traps for ages, Steve Winter, but they were so difficult to use and fiddly to set up and unreliable that basically there was these huge hurdles to actually getting anything from camera traps. And I'd sort of tried on and off and always come up empty-handed. And I just knew that camera traps could be so much easier to use. And by making a camera trap easier to use, it would just open up opportunities for people to be creative and not worry so much about the technology. And so I created a camera trap that was based on the passive infrared sensor that's used in a trail camera. Trail cameras are ultimate in ease. You just turn them on, stick them on a tree, and they're good to go. And so I wanted to create a DSLR style camera trap system that was as close to that as possible. And so keeping them as simple as possible. And gradually over the years, we've added features and perhaps less simple, but sticking with that ethos of, if it's easy to set up, people will be motivated to set up more often, set up more. If you're gone on holiday and you're somewhere for just 4 days, if a camera trap's something that takes 5 hours to set up, you're just not going to do it. But hopefully having something that you could set up in 20 minutes just means that people will be more motivated to do it. And so that was my aim in creating what's now the cam traption system.
Yeah, and it's a great system. I own one. I bought one last year, and I did get my setup down to an hour and a half from 5 hours. So
then
pretty good.
You get it down, and then you start getting fancy with lighting, and then the time climbs again. So now these things do take a long time to set up, but that's often the creative side now. Figuring out how you want to light the scene, and that's, I guess, the stuff that's that the technology hopefully frees you up to do. Is just to concentrate on being creative and not having to worry about the technology so much.
So what was it in your mind that switched from going from making things for yourself to enhance your own photography, to elevate the picture, to then, it's already enough of a headache, to then thinking, I'm going to manufacture this thing. It's a completely different, you're going into a different business, and the issues of, first of all, manufacturing, fulfillment, shipment. We've talked about headaches. A lot of headaches.
I think for me, when I got into photography, and particularly starting to make a living from it, I could always see that the writing was on the wall for, I guess, making a living by just focusing on being a photographer and producing images. Image licensing revenues were plummeting, all these opportunities just to sell photos. And there was, at the same time, this flood of photographers coming in, a lot of them just doing it for the fun and happy to give away their work because they never had any ambition of making it professional, but taking professional standard pictures. So right from the beginning, I think I recognized that the opportunity in being a photographer was in creating products and services that cater to this wave of new photographers, seeing all of them as my customers and not my competition. And, a lot of people have taken this approach and run workshops and photo tours and photo safaris. As wildlife photographers, photo safaris would probably be the most common way people are making a living. And I dabbled in that and, selling ebooks and e-courses and things to educate these people. As I say, these people, they're all looking for ways to either spend their money on equipment or learning. And so, I knew this was my market. And it was then figuring out what the product was going to be. And so when I had people naturally coming to me and asking me to build equipment for them, and being in the industry and seeing that there was nothing out there that was working how I thought it should work, it seemed obviously quite an obvious thing to try. And I started very small. I didn't invest a lot in the first sensors, basically made them as simple and basic as they needed to be to get the job done. And and just started selling them, see how it went. And so that was I think starting simple and rather, not going in and starting with everything set up. I had this basic minimum viable product, set up a Shopify store, and then figure out the shipping, obviously, that's obviously a slightly painful thing. But on that side, I'm a proponent of either doing soft launches where you don't do a lot of marketing at the front, so that you start small, just word of mouth, shipping a few units at a time, and then you learn gradually. Or if you want to really go all out and do the big launch, doing it as a pre-launch where you can then drip out the sales in your own time and check that things are working in terms of the shipping and stuff gradually. Like there's nothing more stressful than having sold a load of things that people are expecting straight away and then encountering these issues with shipping and stuff. So definitely starting slow rather than trying to bite off more than you can chew straight away is how I approached really the whole start of Camtraptions. And then it's just been a gradual, learning and growing process since then. And every now and then you do have a curveball like Brexit, as we were talking about, and trying to ship now suddenly to Europe is overnight became almost impossible for about 6 months. But dealing with each thing as it comes.
Yeah, that in its own is like a wildlife photography project. I think you're right. You do have to have that special mindset when you're going to do that business opportunity with something that, in a way, essentially is generous. You want to share your work and your ideas and get other people, and it's a nice, because I think often wildlife photographers can be criticized, and I think quite rightly so, of keeping their locations and their special places secret. But ultimately it's
and for some photographers that might make sense, but for me it's always, as I say, other photographers have always been they're my market really. So I've always been incredibly transparent and open about how I take my photos, what I'm using to take my photos. And I think that's one of the ways I was able to attract a following of other photographers to which I could then pitch my products to, is by being very open about all that stuff.
Yeah, brilliant, great stuff. And of course, it wasn't only camera traps. You were an early inventor of drones, and I watched one of these videos of you talking about this quite openly and the struggles that you had, and it was just staggering to me to think that basically drones didn't really exist in the way they do now, obviously, but it was only in 2012. So you were developing and making your own prototypes and to carry heavy DSLRs and trying to get stable images.
And I look back on those devices, they were lethal and crazy and expensive, but it was so much fun. Like when I saw that first clip ever of footage shot from a drone, it was like unbelievable. And it appealed to my creative side, building these things and the technology and figuring all that out. It was quite a painful thing. Like the first drone I built literally flew. It was quite a sizable investment in terms of just the parts and time to build it. And literally it flew 20 seconds before I wrote it off, crashing it into a tree. And it was then like a year before I could bring myself to build another drone. But yeah, obviously you can see, the impact drones have had now today, and clearly it was worth sort of figuring out. But I very much focused on trying to make my drones quiet so that they could be used to film wildlife without disturbing animals. But I sort of, after I'd been doing it a couple of years, number one, there was all these big players like DJI who were frankly crushing it in terms of what they were producing. So I was never going to compete with them. But then also drones, number one, the perspective was becoming much more commonplace. And for me, whenever something becomes kind of commonplace, it's an instant turn off for me and I want to go on to the next thing. And then also, the potential for harassing wildlife. It's just something I didn't really want to be associated with. Even if you do it responsibly, people can't look at that footage and know that you were being responsible.
Yeah, sure.
So I was just like,
I've just had this image in my head of like, when you see those old black and white movies of people trying to invent planes and fly and crashing into trees and those early days.
You don't want to know how many drones I crashed, how many GoPros I killed in drone crashes.
Yeah. But you were primarily building drones for stills, is that right? Or both?
Yeah. So stills have always been my thing. And so I think that was the other thing about drones is I built them, to take stills with, but it was always the footage from a drone that was, for me, what was magical. And so I think drones probably are of more value to filmmakers than stills photographers. There are other ways you can get an aerial perspective with stills that you can't really match with video.
Yeah. And presumably the early cameras as well didn't, when you were building these, they didn't have that high quality video capability.
Yeah. So all the video I shot with drones was on a GoPro.
Right.
Even if, I could fly something bigger than that. Yeah. Because it wasn't mirrorless in those days. But the video is always what I, took from the drone footage. And so I guess the culmination of my drone efforts were this video I made of the Great Migration in the Serengeti. I don't know if anyone had really done the Serengeti migration with a drone before that. And it was incredible footage. But yeah, in the end, it's not exactly where I wanted to go with my photography, and video isn't what I do. So yeah, it was a sort of phase. But then I returned to after I sort of drew a line under drones, returned to Beetle Cam, and realized there was still a lot further I could take that.
So that's a good skill as well, isn't it? To know when you're even though you have this incredible determination to make things work, it's also good to know when to leave it alone and move on.
We've only got so much time, and so you do have to be ruthless with ideas and with things. And if I'd stuck with drones, I'm sure I'd be doing cool stuff today with them. But also recognizing what it is you want to be doing and what it and following that. There's a compromise, I guess, between persevering and knowing when to pivot.
Exactly. And actually, on that pivoting, you just mentioned that stills is something that you were always interested in doing and continue to do. And I was curious about video because obviously the capability of DSLRs, producing 4K, and now you've got mirrorless cameras producing 8K video. That temptation of must be there with things like Beetle Cam or maybe drones again. I don't want to put any ideas in your head of going back to. Sounds like you won't anyway. But is video something that you are consciously avoiding now?
Well, no, I've certainly dabbled in it, and I've done enough of it to know that I really don't enjoy it that much, and it's not what my strength is. And the way I feel about it is it's very hard to do both properly. You're either doing neither properly, neither stills and video properly, or one is very much subservient to the other, in which case, you're not doing it properly. So, and I also don't see video, replacing stills. Like there's always, for me, stills have their own place that can never be replaced by video. Obviously books, magazines, prints for walls, but also online, like the way you can scroll down a news feed and instantly digest a photo, which you just can't do with the video because you have to let it play for 5-10 seconds to even see what it's about. So I don't think stills will ever be replaced by video. And as I say, I don't think I can do video properly if I'm also trying to do stills. So for me, the way I've started to approach it more recently is collaborating. So I'll team up with a filmmaker. They can focus 100% of their efforts and creativity on the video. I can focus 100% of my efforts on the stills, make the stills as good as I possibly can make them, and do it that way. And that's the way I'm sort of going to approach this hybridization of the two media going forward. And the filmmaker I do work with also shoots Sony, and so we share lenses. We often share cameras, but he's got his video hat on and I've got my stills hat on, and for me that's what works. I trying to do both is a nightmare. But video is very valuable, particularly for showing the behind the scenes of a project, like a project that the sort of projects I do that's just stills. It's kind of only showing half the story, and you're really only, I guess, taking half the cake, because the behind the scenes of that stills project is also just as interesting to people. There's just as much opportunity to use that sort of content. And so showing that, and particularly with video, is very valuable, and certainly something I do try and, if I'm on my own, force myself, if I can, to shoot some of that behind the scenes video. But as I say, team up with a filmmaker to do that as well.
I think that's good advice. It's basically a case of stick to what you're really good at.
Yeah.
And also, again, I'd encourage anyone to go on YouTube and look up Will, because there's so many good behind the scenes stuff, and you're very generous.
There's a bit on there,
just showing the trials and tribulations, and also just how this stuff's set up, and like you said with the idea of camtraptions, how yes, you can go down the route of it being incredibly difficult to try and achieve, hard to get pictures in terms of lighting, but essentially these camera traps work at the same technology. For those who don't know, is pretty much like a security light, right? And instead of sending that signal to turn a light on, it's telling your camera to fire the shutter.
Exactly.
There's some brilliant behind the scenes stuff. I know you've talked a lot about your leopard project, but for them, I'm sure will be people who haven't heard about it, listen to this. So, we could kind of distill that. And again, I'd encourage everyone to go and have a look at Will's TED Talk. But can you tell us the beginnings of that story? And Will's got a lovely book out, which we've had a brief chat before this podcast, which is another, in a sense, advantage of the lockdown. You're able to have time to put this book together. And I can't wait. I haven't actually seen it myself. I can't wait to have a look. Because one of the things I was curious about is that, wow, how do you make a whole book?
Oh, well, it's actually a lot of writing. Yeah. It's the whole story leading up to it. So that's why I needed so much time, because writing doesn't come quick to me. And so I did have a lot of months in the first lockdown to write the book. And it is, the story of everything that led up to this Black Leopard project. And really, for me, it did feel like this culmination of everything I'd been working towards. It. On the one hand, it was all this technology and techniques I'd been developing to photograph wildlife at night. Really, that had been a big focus for me for 3 or 4 years preceding the Black Leopard. Was the low light ability of digital cameras was really opening up this whole frontier of nocturnal wildlife photography. And that was something that was very exciting to me, because when you start photographing at night, you've got this blank canvas to experiment with lighting, to experiment with exposing, using ambient moonlight or twilight or stars. There's so much cool creative stuff you could do, which was really exciting to me and something I'd been playing with already. So I'd been playing with these techniques. I'd been developing equipment that would allow me to take these sort of photographs, the camera traps being the main one. And then I'd also started working on these long-term projects where I'd really based myself in a country for a long time, set up my infrastructure there, and just revisit the same subject or place again and again as I built up a body of work. And by lucky coincidence, I moved to Kenya, basically, moved to operating in Kenya, and had just finished doing this long-term project with the Tsavo Trust on the elephants in Tsavo. And so I just finished that. I had all my equipment and my setup in Kenya. All these techniques for photographing animals at night. And that's when I heard, I was just on a phone call with a guide who mentioned that there was a chance of seeing a black leopard up in this place in Laikipia, in Kenya. And even before that, black leopards had been on my radar as pretty much the ultimate creature I'd love to photograph one day, but also a creature that it wasn't even a dream really, because I knew the chances were so minimal, particularly in Africa, which is where I do all my stuff. So when I heard it, obviously my ears pricked up, and I was like, I've got to look into this a bit more. And it always felt like quite a long shot. This was an animal. I got in touch with the guides and the camp owner at Laikipia Wilderness Camp about how often were they seeing this black leopard, and it was something they might see a few times a year on night drives. So it was there, but knowing where it was hanging out and how I could go about photographing it seemed...
And they have such big ranges.
Yeah. Well, they didn't even know where its territory was, how old it was or anything like that. So it was, as far as I was concerned, there was a black leopard there, and I had to go and just see if I could get a photo. And I thought I might be setting up trail cameras. I brought like 10 trail cameras out with me. And I was thinking, I might spend a year moving these around just to try and figure out if there's a path it might be using fairly regularly or something, and then setting up my DSLR camera trap. So I thought that might be how it went. But anyway, went out there, took all my camera traps. I already had some high quality DSLR camera traps from Tsavo that I'd been using. So I took it all up there, and I was introduced to basically the neighboring landowner, this lady called Louisa. And she was the one that had really been seeing this black leopard much more frequently. And it turned out that it was this young black leopard, this young male, that was basically still young enough that he was in his mother's territory. And actually it was quite a small territory, basically centered around where she was living. And so her and her security guards, a ranger people, were seeing it quite regularly.
How regularly? Do you remember?
I mean, they would... If you stayed... It was quite a nocturnal creature. They weren't seeing it a lot during the day. But at night... as particularly when it was very dry, there was only a few areas where the leopard could come for water, one being the landowner's swimming pool and one this little spring just up from there. And so I think that quite regularly at night, the security people were seeing it, maybe a couple of times a week. And because it was young, it just wasn't straying that far from this area. So, that was obviously sounded like a dream for camera trap project. But the thing was, they reckon this leopard was about 18 months, and that's the sort of age where it would leave its mother's territory, so it would get kicked off by a stronger male that would want to mate with the mother and have more cubs. So I was like, have I arrived too late? They'd seen it a couple of weeks ago. Is it still there, or have I just missed it? So it was pretty nerve-wracking. But long story short, set up the camera traps, and within the first week, I'd got my first photos.
Wow.
That first trip was 2 weeks long, and I got a handful, 4 or 5 decent photos. And that from there, while I knew where this leopard was, it was an opportunity to keep working it, as I said, double down on it while I could.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, I had all these shots in mind that I wanted to try and capture. And so then it was a case of, while he was around, just trying to tick off as many of those as possible. And it ended up being a year where I was pretty heavily focused on that one project, moving camera traps around, setting them up, ticking off these shots. And those are the photos that then form the basis for the book.
So when you've got something like this dream opportunity that's unexpected, and I don't know whether you're about to come home. I mean, you've got, by that point, did you have 2 small children? And how do you then negotiate that time and childcare, and your wife's a doctor?
So they came out with me for a lot of it. We were able to spend a month at Easter out there, 2 months in the summer out there. And then between those trips, it was little trips on my own. But the great thing with camera traps is actually you only need a few days to set them up or move them around. And then it's a case of leaving them running for another 2 months or whatever. So I was able to keep those camera traps running constantly for that year, while still actually spending quite a bit of time at home in the UK. Because at the end of the day with camera traps, the longer you leave them for, the more you get. And so it is a case of, I had them all set up with solar panels and stuff to basically run indefinitely. And I had one of Louisa's Ascaris, a guy called Patrick. I sort of trained him how to keep the lenses clean and stuff. And so they just kept running that whole time. And that's the only way to, particularly some of those shots, like the star shot that I really wanted with the leopard under the stars. It was basically 5 cameras set up for that shot for about 6 months before eventually the leopard came by at the right time of night and looking the right way for that shot to come together. But it's just a numbers game. More camera traps set up for longer.
And what I love about that picture is, you're not just content with getting the picture. You have to have a behind the scenes picture of you getting the picture.
That was just, I had the spare camera, and rather than carting it back home, that was actually an infrared camera. So I'd started by photographing the leopard with an infrared camera and invisible flashes, because I didn't know how shy it was going to be. Pretty soon I discovered he didn't care at all about the white light, but I had this infrared camera set up, spare, that I just set up for this behind the scenes. So I often have a sensor trigger a couple of 2 or 3 cameras, and then they all share the same lighting, because I might have one, for example, with that star shot. If the moon had been up, the star shot wouldn't work. So I have one camera a bit higher that's then got the leopard against a backdrop, not the sky. And so when the moon's up, that camera gets a photo that works. And then I have a lower camera looking up, which is the camera that works for the photo when the moon is down. And then, it wasn't much just to add a third camera to then shoot the behind the scenes. But I love that, because there is a behind the scenes photo of the exact millisecond the actual other photo was captured.
It's incredible.
So it's quite nice having that.
It really is. And again, it's that kind of generosity of showing your methods and the ways and the efforts, and also just seeing the gear and the setup. And I was thinking, actually, as you were talking about leaving these cameras running for many months at a time, actually in a way is kind of going back to the film days. So there must, we lost the magic really of not knowing what we've got. And even though that was hugely frustrating, when you had that film processed and you're looking, through your contact sheet, there's this rush. And I certainly, when I first got cam trap films last year, as a newbie, it's like, wow, you're just so excited, and then that does quickly wear off.
The disappointment.
What's gone wrong? The animal's in the wrong place. It's not there. Something else has set it off.
Yeah.
But that going back over and over again, and then when you eventually do, and I got a great shot, which is in the Fox book, is that thrill?
It's like Christmas.
It is, isn't it? When and can you describe that feeling?
Well, so my early days of camera trapping, much like yours, it sounds, I'd go for something. I'd set up a camera trap outside an aardvark burrow for 2 nights and come back and be sure I'd got it and find nothing. And very quickly, you get that sense of hope and anticipation beaten out of you. And I came to basically have zero expectations when checking any cameras. And then anything you do have is a bonus. And so now leaving cameras much longer, I increase my chances. But yeah, I'm often not expecting much on these cameras. And particularly when I first got that black leopard photo, I'd already checked I had 5 cameras set up, checked the other 4 with nothing on. And so I really had no expectations. And I almost could have flicked past the photo because this black animal in the black of night was basically, I don't know what I was expecting, but it was basically invisible. It was only its eyes, and I was flicking through sort of nonchalantly, not expecting to find this leopard. Just those 2 eyes fortunately made me pause, and then obviously realized what I got. But yeah, I mean, that was I guess a moment that will never be matched in terms of how much that meant, because it was so rare and such a stunning creature, and something that I really, honestly, I don't think expected to achieve in a way. And
that's brilliant, and that's really great to hear, because often when we do get images that we're satisfied with, I would say is probably a good word, because I think we're always trying to achieve better as photographers.
But you can never get perfection.
No.
In
so that was going to be my question. When now that it's done, you've got this book, and it's not just that image, there are other lovely images of this leopard. What are the ways, particularly with the shot with the stars in the background, the low angle, would you think, how could you improve that picture?
It can always be better. And I don't think I've taken a shot where I've looked at it and not seen something that could be better next time. Even if it's just lower ISO and less noise or whatever it is, or slightly sharper stars, or, there's lots. Every photo, as I say, has something that can be improved. And I think that's what I think maybe was a way in which I'd maybe plateaued, and then the way that I got beyond that plateau was realizing that when you've got the shot, it might be the shot you're after, but it can always be improved. And if you keep working at it and keep trying to improve it and persevere, that is how you can sort of elevate your work to the next level. And so not ever being satisfied, I think, and always, once you feel like you've maybe achieved the project, maybe still sticking at it, as I say, doubling down on it and still pushing yourself to go further, because that's when you're forced to maybe do stuff differently, be more experimental, take more risks because you've got the safe shots in the bag, and that's what then pushes you, I think, to get even better. And so actually I would say, since the book came out and the black leopard was still there, I still have some camera traps out there running, and now they're just going for completely speculative, once in a, whatever 1,000-day type event might happen where everything comes together to get this shot I'm after. But, there still is always better shots. So like the last shot I was going for was like the leopard at twilight with the backdrop exposed and stuff. And it basically took a year. It was a year during COVID where I couldn't get out there, but the camera trap was running, and there's still other shots to tick off. And so now the black leopard, he's obviously much older now. He's 4 or 5, and he's expanded his range a lot. He covers a lot of different areas and kind of swings by where my camera traps are, like maybe once every month or 2.
Wow.
So my odds are pretty low now to get him. But there's still loads of spotty leopards around. I can't really turn my nose up at them. So
no, that's right. I loved it in your TED talk when you talked about how it was, you couldn't be disappointed by getting a beautiful spotty leopard in there. But
well, that particular spotty leopard was this big male, and whenever he was around, it would drive off the young black male. So it was literally, if I was getting him, I knew I wasn't going to be able to get the black leopard until he disappeared. So he was a very impressive specimen, and I got some really nice.
So when you looked at those photos and you open, you're scrolling through, you're going, "Oh my God, just get out of my photo! Beautiful big, spotty leopard."
Exactly.
Amazing. You talked a bit earlier about working with the trust in Tsavo, the Elephant Trust.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you a bit about photography and conservation, and it's something that we talk about a lot on the podcast. It's something that cannot be ignored now for wildlife photographers. And there's obviously stuff up on your website about the work that you do. But can you talk a little bit about what you hope to achieve? And I know that very much trying to elevate wildlife photography, elevate the pictures that you're taking to kind of create that wow factor. But of course, it's always a problem. Like beyond that, how do we create action and get people to love it and care about it? And
I think, if you can have a double purpose in your work, when obviously producing work people want to look at, but if it can have a conservation benefit as well, then that's the ultimate aim. And so, for me, partnering with conservationists is crucial, really, to the way I work and want to work going forwards. Conservationists need content just as much as everybody else, in terms of images and footage for social media reports, for communicating what they're doing to the outside world. They can't exist in a silo, just like every other business or charity out there. So they need images, and so working with conservationists, really for me, it's about going to them, or sometimes being approached by them, but finding out exactly what it is they need and what their goals are, and what I can do to basically support that as best I possibly could. And then in return, from them, it's not, I'm never really partnering with conservationists, trying to monetize that relationship, expecting them to pay me. Really what they can give me is access, and I can give them whatever it is they need, whether it's just stills or whether it's something more. So in the case of the Tsavo Trust, they were working to protect these big tusker elephants in Tsavo, this huge area, the size of Switzerland. And in this area, there's a handful of these big tuskers, which would be defined as as any elephant with tusks weighing over 100 pounds. And there's a few famous big tuskers in Amboseli, for example, which are quite easy to see and well photographed. But Tsavo had some of these big tuskers that were in such remote areas. There weren't, it was kilometers and kilometers to the nearest road even. So, and you can't off-road in the national park. So they're just tuskers that nobody was seeing and nobody was really photographing. But these are what they were trying to protect. And by protecting these big tuskers, in effect, keeping those areas secure, it was securing all the area for all the elephants there and all the wildlife. So their goal was protecting these tuskers, and in doing so, protecting Tsavo basically. But communicating that to people and showing people what they were protecting is hard without images. And so Richard Moller, the guy who set up Tsavo Trust, had the idea that it'd be great to put together a book, of photos of these big tuskers that they could just use it to communicate, show people what it is they were trying to save. And it was very fortunate, really, that he was then introduced to me, and we then hatched this plan for me to go to Tsavo and photograph these big tuskers. And we used to get enough variety for a whole book. There's lots of different types of photos that I then ended up taking, a lot of long lens stuff. To find the tuskers, it was a lot of flying from the air, so some aerial stuff. And then when we found them from the air, going in on the ground to try and get more intimate stuff. And for big tusker elephants in particular, Betocam was the perfect tool to get that perspective that really has these animals towering over the camera with these tusks sweeping down towards the camera. It was like
it always comes back to Betocam.
Yeah, well, exactly. I ended up returning to Betocam for that, and so those are for me some of my favorite photos from the project are of those big tuskers with Betocam. But then what they wanted was a book. So the project didn't stop with getting the photos. Then I basically then fulfilled my side of the bargain by then putting them together into the book. And this is a book I did totally by myself, from everything from the layout and dealing with the printers and getting it printed, and then the challenge of getting these books out to Kenya for them to use, which, oh my gosh, that's not a story, and it's a complete nightmare, but got there in the end. And so it was, I guess for me, it was a dream opportunity to work with them, to actually just have access to these tuskers. For me, that's what made it all worthwhile. And for them, they got what they wanted out of it, which was a book that they could use and photos that they could use. And so I think that's how any photographer can approach relationships with conservationists is, don't look at, you might be a working photographer wanting to make your living from photography, but I don't look at these organizations as potential income. It's very much, what can I do for you, and how can I support what you're doing? Because these guys are, I guess, the real heroes in terms of what they're doing. We can try and take action or whatever, but these are the guys to the sport, because these are the guys who are making the real impact. So that was I guess quite a turning point for me. That project is now really working on these long-term book projects has become pretty much all I want to do, really, is one book project after the next, and put in as long as required to do that justice.
Yeah, and we were talking about that over lunch, how thankfully, the digital revolution didn't kill the need for coffee table books, and which is good. I've just printed one with Neil and Andy, of course.
A great book. If you haven't seen it yet.
Thanks for the plug, Will. I think well, from our perspective, we were under no illusion that everybody who hates foxes is going to read our book and then love them. But I think, like you were talking about, that collaborative effort where you've got this vast array of skills to create engaging images, that is what captures people's attention in the first instance. And if then the Savo Trust can put out a really nice book or report or social media post with powerful imagery,
exactly,
there's those split seconds where, like you mentioned earlier, when you're scrolling through these days, it's just noise, isn't it? If you can capture people's attention on a phone screen of an image that's tiny, then that's the beginning, isn't it? And then they might go on and to read or support or give money to. And I often think it's we are surrounded by so much negative news and biodiversity crisis and climate crises that it is really tough to kind of think about, okay, so what difference really are we making? But I've learned over the years that it is always a collaborative effort, and that photographers and images are a very small part, an important part, definitely, but a very small part, once with sound science and with other media organizations and people putting stuff out, whether it's photo festivals or books or campaigns, that we do play a role, but we're definitely not the most important.
No. And that's the thing, though. Every species or conservation organization have different challenges that they're facing where we can potentially help. So as you say, with foxes, it might be a PR problem, and producing a book that makes people fall in love with foxes might be the best way we can help as photographers. Another project I did, pretty much the first big conservation project I did, was with Ethiopian wolves. And there it was a case of making a book which we could sell to raise funds to support the conservationists. And so that was a different way that we helped. And so, I think that's what's so key, is really going to the conservationists and figuring it out what it is they need from us, and then trying to make that work.
And very much like what Margot's been doing for the last 6-7 years. Again, it's just raising money using these creative platforms like Kickstarter for frontline conservation. It's I think it's important not to kind of get bogged down by the pressure of that we all have to be conservation photographers. First and foremost, work on your craft. I'm moving into the sort of education side of things because it's something that we talk about a lot. Is for the next generation. I've certainly experienced that by speaking to younger people who are into nature photography and struggling with what they want to do or what they want to achieve with their images. But what would your advice be in that instance for someone who looks at your work, admires it, wants to try and get into helping organizations with really good pictures? Where would they start?
Well, I think there's two things there. Firstly, it's and this is something I fell in the trap of sort of doing when I was getting started, is not focusing and flitting from this to that. All these bucket list things I wanted to photograph and go there for 2 weeks, tick that off and go on to the next thing. But what I've since, I guess, discovered the hard way is that really there's no substitute for just focusing on a subject or a place, an animal, whatever it is, and making that subject your own. We can all set our work apart from everyone else just by focusing and doing it in more depth and spending more time on it than anyone else has done. And I think particularly, if you don't have the opportunities to travel a lot, finding a subject close to home, a conservation organization close to home that you can partner with, and then, really just focusing on it and creating a body of work with depth. And that has a lot of benefits to your own photography as well, because once you've taken, I think I mentioned it before, but once you've taken those easy shots, that's when you're forced to become much more creative and imaginative and push yourself to continue getting new images. And that's what raises your photography to the next level. So by focusing, I think you can do the most good for whoever you've partnered with. And ultimately, that's what then leads to you producing these body of works that are much more noteworthy in themselves. And that then stands you in good stead to then make your next project perhaps further afield or slightly more ambitious. But I think it does, whatever it is you're focusing on, how close to home or how little the subject, it is creating that body of work with depth that is key.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. again, while I'm kind of looking around your office and thinking about Chemtraptions, thinking about you prototyping, we looked at your 3D printer next door. I was curious how you maximize your efficacy. Also, you've got 2 young children and a wife, and you're going to Africa a lot. Have you got things? Do you feel like you're spinning plates? Are you good at saying, okay, I'm going to do Chemtraptions for a couple of hours this morning, then I'm going to process images, then I'm going to think about my next projects? How do you?
I mean, if you've got any secrets or tips here.
This is what. This is my excuse of running these podcasts, is so I can meet all these great photographers and steal their ways of working.
I think that's my biggest struggle, is definitely what to prioritize and what to spend my time on, because time is literally the one thing you can never really have enough of. So I've sort of now, it took a long time to get to where I am now. Like 5 years ago when I first had kids, I hardly traveled, I hardly took a photo because Chemtraptions was new and it needed me to run. So step by step though, recognizing that, and then I brought my brother on, who basically now runs that, which freed me up to sort of leave Chemtraptions unattended more and more, for more and more of the year. So I think very much having an end goal in mind, and just, even if it takes a while to get there, step by step moving in the right direction. And so recognizing if you need to free up time or delegate or stop doing stuff. And I think learning to say no. I think in the early days of being a photographer, you do say yes to everything, and you have time to say yes to everything, because frankly, otherwise you're just sitting there twiddling your thumbs. So you get to a stage though where you reach a point where you do have to start saying no, which doesn't come naturally and feels like you're missing out on opportunities. But I think kids are what made that flick the switch there for me, and that suddenly I did realize you couldn't do everything. And so I guess not being tempted, I'd love to go photograph polar bears, but actually that's going to come at the expense of this book project I'm working on, or traveling away from the kids or whatever. So knowing that one day maybe I'll get to it, but right now focusing on this one project I'm doing, and leaving certain things for another day. And now the way that I guess structure my the way I work is, when I'm in Africa, focus 100% on the photos. I literally try and ignore everything else. My emails, literally stop responding for weeks on end. There's a big backlog, but obviously maybe things slip through the cracks. But that allows me to at least put 100% into my photos and to getting those, doing that justice. When I'm in the UK, I hardly take a photo. It's 100% the business, the other stuff that goes into it, photo processing, whatever it is. But I haven't got projects on the go here so much that are tearing me away from that and making me, confusing what it is in my head I should be doing at this time. And so I find that splitting my 2 hats, I guess, the business hat and the photography hat, into what I do when I'm in Africa and what I do when I'm here, is for me what makes most sense. During COVID, I did a little bit of photography in the UK just because I got itchy.
Yeah, you need to practice as well. I mean, I often talk about practicing an instrument, and if you didn't pick up the guitar for a few weeks, you'd be rusty. So
and certainly in those early days where you're learning the craft, then take photos as much as you can, as often as you can, because that's all you need to do to keep progressing. But nowadays where you've got to compromise and pick what you do, that's how I tend to do it.
That's great. And saying no is learning to say no is an art, isn't it, and a craft Definitely. In itself. And valuing your time, and certainly kids stop the procrastination and help Definitely. You focus when you do grab time when you're lucky enough to get bits and pieces of childcare here and there.
Exactly.
We're going to slowly come to an end. I've got a few more questions. And first of all, you talked about this current project, and you recently returned from Kenya just last Friday, right? So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I guess my big project at the moment, which has actually been a year and a half already that I've been working on it, is a book on lions. I went from the black leopard, pretty much the rarest animal I'll ever photograph, and I was like, where do I go from here? And I decided not to try and find anything as rare again. I'll go the opposite. I'll go to lions, a very well photographed subject. But try and do it a bit different and do something that would justify a new book on them. And so doing a lot with lions at night, trying to convey that side of their lives, because essentially lions do most of what they do at night. So really focusing on that. And so most of my trips over the last 2 years have been mostly focusing on lions in the Mara and Serengeti, with a view to doing a book on that. But yeah, to do lions justice, I'm not going to rush this, and I think it's going to be I've still got quite a few shots I still want to try and tick off. So I'm not going to sort of push myself to finish this project until I feel like I have done it justice. So I reckon probably another year or two working on this before I'm ready to release them.
Yeah, if you don't have the pressure of a publisher breathing down your neck.
Yeah, which I don't yet. Yeah,
that's fabulous.
Yeah.
That was going to be my next question. Is what are you good at? Putting on self-imposed deadlines. I guess a lot of the driving force comes from the guts, doesn't it? The feeling of like, okay, I've got have I got enough? Have I got enough shot variety?
I think I'm probably the person that's quite bad at finishing a project because I can always see more that I could do. Fortunately, the last 2 book projects, like the elephant one, they needed a book. I needed to finish it and get the book done and given to them in a reasonable space of years. So that sort of pushed me to finish that. And then the Black Leopard project really came to an end for me because COVID happened. I couldn't get out there. I had the time to do the book. And so I drew a line under there. Otherwise, I think I would still be photographing this black leopard because it's such a dream subject. Yeah, this lion one's going to be hard because there's no pressure to end it. And so I think there's a few shots which if I tick them off, I think I'll be happy. And I think I'll know I'll have enough variety to do this book justice. But yeah, if I don't get them, I might just keep going until who knows when I'll be still at it in 10 years' time.
Yeah, and I'm curious as well. I always... when I think about you, I just think about camera traps and you leaving all these cameras out in the field. Obviously, there's risk of them getting trashed by animals or stolen or whatever else. So you also, can you give us an idea of how much time you're actually behind the lens yourself? Say, for example, this lion project.
Yeah. Well, all these projects, I'm behind the lens a fair bit in that with the camera traps even, I would go out, if I was out in Kenya for a month, I might spend 3 days at the beginning moving the camera traps around. Then I'd go away for a week, do something else, long lens handheld photography, then go back, pop into the camera traps. And so, yeah, I've always got a camera. And even if the project I'm working on is a camera trap project, I'll be doing other things with the handheld camera in between. Lions is a great subject because, sunrise, sunset, I can be doing long lens stuff. At any time there could be interesting behavior, a hunt or something where you need to get the long lens out quickly. But then also they're often just sitting there and that gives you opportunities to do other stuff and beetle cam photos and star photos, all sorts of stuff like that. And one of the big things I've started doing with this project, trying to get natural lion behavior at night without impacting it, obviously you can't start shining lights if they're hunting because it'll impact the hunt. So I'm trying to do quite a bit in infrared with infrared floodlights, infrared converter cameras, literally working in pitch black, trying to, it's what I was doing the last week was I've got subject in front of me, an infrared spotlight that's really focused to make quite a nice attractive lighting. But I basically find my whole time like trying to wave this infrared beam that I can't see with my own eyes around, trying to find the lion in it and take the photo. It's it's going to be a challenge.
Sounds like you need an assistant for this one.
Oh, I sort of had one as well, but but anyway, it's figuring out stuff like that. And I think it's not trying to go out for 2 weeks and get that shot and tick it off straight away. It's like going out, testing this equipment and this concept, definitely failing the first time or even the first few times, but every time going out with the learnings from the last trip and iterating, trying to solve these problems and trying again and persevering. And so there was these particular shots I was trying to get with the lions and stars. The first time, the first trip didn't work. The second trip didn't work. It was on the third trip then finally figured out the right combination of equipment and time of year and everything to get the shot. And just keep plugging away.
It's great to hear. I mean, Neil, who's been a brilliant influence and he's also very generous with his techniques he's been doing camera trapping for 9 years.
Yeah.
He talks about that is that it's very much every time you go out, you're just narrowing that margin. I mean, there's always going to be errors, but the more times you go through and refine that setup, then the less chances that you'll make a mistake, and then you're just more then relying on the chance and luck of the animal breaking that beam at the right time. And
exactly.
But it's definitely an exercise. I mean, that's the thing about wildlife photography. It's hard enough as it is, when you're just behind the lens and there's beautiful light. But when you're leaving stuff out there and relying on flashes and everything else. And actually, I'd forgotten to ask you this because it comes up quite a lot, and I'm sure you've been asked it lots in the past, is about, in wildlife competitions, you get a lot of what would describe as sort of traditional wildlife photographers complaining about, camera trap photographs winning all the awards now, and it's not really proper photography. They weren't behind the camera.
But they're the people that would have been 10 years ago complaining about digital cameras and them being cheating and not being true photography. And so I think you always get people, and I'll be there one day where I can't, feel like I don't want to keep having to learn new stuff and evolve with the times. But, that's the thing. It's particularly wildlife photography, I think, is very dependent on the technology, really. When you're trying to photograph animals that don't want to be photographed and often needing to be as unobtrusive as possible, technology is the thing that can give you that, I guess, that way in and that sort of edge over the subject, or to get the shot you want. And so I think wildlife photography in particular is a case of moving with the times. You see it in wildlife filmmaking as well, how critical the latest camera technology is to every new film that comes out, really as a way to set what you're producing apart from what's come before. And so I don't think there's any getting around the fact that you have to be moving with the, in a way. Also there are opportunities, particularly in the wildlife competitions, to just have that creative eye and be creative, but you always then battling against the technology.
Yeah, that's right. I've thought now that I've felt the pain of camera traps, and I didn't have that attitude before, but I think actually probably most of the people that are complaining about it have never actually used one.
And it's so creative, from the lighting, it's all pure photography, the way you light it, the way you compose it. You're composing it knowing where the animal will be pretty precisely. So all the same principles apply as normal photography. It's just you've then got the battle of weatherproofing and making sure it runs reliably, and all these headaches, power consumption of everything, and all those headaches that go into camera trapping on top of normal photography. So I certainly don't see it as any less of an art form.
No, definitely more. So what about the future? Are you someone that thinks 5, 10, 15 years ahead? Have you got any hopes, wishes and dreams?
That's a good question.
You could have retired after getting that image of the black leopard.
Well, you would have thought so, but nobody paid that much for it. I think, for me, there's a lot of book projects. I have, a list of things I'd love to do projects on, and each one of them represents a 2-year commitment or something. So I think just working through these projects is pretty much my plan for the foreseeable future, as long as I'm able to. And continuing to keep one eye on technology and what that's opening up in terms of possibilities. Finish this Lion project in the short, medium, or maybe long term. Who knows how long that'll take? And then moving on to the next one, and at the same time continuing to evolve the camtraption stuff and make that more accessible and easier for people to use, because it's very rewarding also seeing all the creative stuff that customers are doing, the stuff that I obviously wouldn't be able to do myself, have time to do, have access to. So seeing what other people are doing with this equipment and putting it to good for conservation purposes as well is very rewarding. So splitting my time between those two goals, really.
That's brilliant. And a great place to end. Will, thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's been really great fun talking to you and seeing your office. Oh, and actually, just very quickly, because I read that Beetle Cam is how old now? 10, 12 years?
No, it was 2009, so it's now 12, 13. 13 years coming.
So what about the future of Beetle? That's something you've always gone back to, it seems.
Well, so now it's a little bit of it's quite advanced now. It's a bit of a tank. I'm not sure. I guess cameras get smaller as a trend, high quality cameras. So if I can make Beetle cameras smaller and smaller as cameras get smaller and better quality, that will maybe allow me to make it even less of a pain to transport around. So I think now it's just getting it as small as possible will be the thing.
Brilliant. Well, look, we'll get some shots. We'll put them up on the page, and we'll get this out to as far and as wide as possible. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much, Will. What an inspiration. And what I love about Will is just how much he shares about his process, techniques, and approach to always try and elevate the picture to inspire, and he certainly inspires me. So there's no excuse. Check out all the links to his YouTube channel, website, Instagram, and Camtraptions. All of this equipment is, by photography standards, very affordable, and it's just about putting in the time. So if you haven't, I strongly suggest giving it a go. It's really good fun, hugely frustrating, but really good fun. And yeah, you can check out all of these links by heading over to the podcast page. And also, please help us to share these podcasts and the stories behind the work of all my amazing guests. Thank you so much, and see you next time.